We are MythVision.
Welcome to MythVision, guys. Your host, Derek Lambert. I'm here to bring you guys some special guests today. Dr. Luther G. Williams is still editing the book. Be on the lookout. You guys will show him some love when that comes out. Let's get right into this. I love this show that we're about to do. Fascinated. I'm a student of these two characters, and these guys are stand-up men that have been joining us on the podcast, and they're going to continue to bring you guys the truth as they see it and that they've done their research. We have Dr. Robert Eisenman, and we have Christopher Lawson. How are you two gentlemen?
Very well. Surviving.
Yes, sir. I figure, why not jump in? We'll go with the master first. Dr. Robert Eisenman has written many books. I will not list them all, but I will mention a few of them. James, the brother of Jesus, okay, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's got Breaking the Dead Sea Scrolls Monopoly, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. He's written multiple versions of James, the brother of Jesus, and go down in the description of this video. Be sure to get you a copy. They've got it in PDF. He's got it in hardback. Preferably get the Penguin version. That's the best version that he has, and he encourages that version. It's a big one. The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, New Testament Code, and on and on and on it goes. He is definitely a scholar. He's been a professor. He's taught on Islam, the Bible, and he's been very controversial. He's even gone so far as to suggest the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, was actually a fake. He's come out bold about a lot of things. You've seen him on TV. He's been on...
I wouldn't say it's a fake. I'd say it isn't his.
It isn't his. Okay.
It's an actual ossuary, so it's not a fake.
Thank you for correcting me. Guys, he's been on...
No, it's just not James's.
Interesting. Okay, well, you heard it from the man. And
you know where he was buried, and he wasn't buried in an ossuary, so there we go.
Well, thank you so much for correcting me. And Christopher Lawson, he has written some work right now. He's got a book, PDF format, Reconstructing Jesus. What if the historical Jesus was the heir to the throne? A reconstruction based on the first century Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's C.H. Lawson. How are you two gentlemen doing?
I'm doing all right.
Just having a pick-me-up here to survive.
Well, let's dive right in, guys, because we want to talk about this New Testament situation and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'd like to start first off with what, and we'll ask you, Dr. Eisenman, if you don't mind, what made you think these scrolls were dated around the New Testament or first century context when all the other scholars say, hey, this is second century BC?
Yeah, but they got everything wrong because, first of all, they have the enemies as the Maccabees, and these are totally in the spirit of the Maccabees. You couldn't be the enemies of the Maccabees with the aggressive militancy that you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, for one, it's just that their mindset was already oriented towards, oh, well, the Maccabees, this isn't Christianity. These are some aggressive, militant, revolutionary Jews. This has nothing to do with us. And because we're dealing with churches and beautiful buildings with some kind of pagan iconography of someone hanging on a cross, and they portray him. You're not supposed to have images in Judaism. You go into these churches. I just saw a whole program on this the other day. That's why it's in my mind, and it's frightening to me. It's frightening because it's pure paganism.
Would you like to tag on that? Because I'd like both of you to be able to piggyback and if you will, collaborate on trying to give evidence why what you see that makes you say, hey, these Dead Sea Scrolls aren't talking second century. The context of them are really dealing with a first century issue between a pro-Roman sect and these Messianics. So...
one of the things that I see as a big commonality between the whole Jesus movement and the Maccabean history is the concept of a pious ending. And the Maccabean brothers all went to the end. They went to the limit, faithful unto death. And that is a lockstep match to the Jesus movement. Josephus said concerning the fourth philosophy, which I link to the Jesus movement, that these people were so faithful unto death and faced such tortures that it was impossible for Josephus to do proper justice to the descriptions for his readers' sake, and that he fears that his readers might not believe him, but if they don't believe him, they should believe that he's being too conservative in his description if they have any doubt about what he's saying, that these people took horrible, painful deaths, and they took it in stride, even the kids, because they were going to be faithful to their heritage, and they weren't going to give it up at the last minute when they thought they were about to what they thought they were winning a crown.
Well, the problem also with speaking about Jesus is you have material written under Herodian Roman auspices, basically, mostly overseas in a foreign language. And you can hardly prove a Palestinian context to it. So you don't know how much of it is accurate. You don't know. That was my original problem in dealing with the different gospels. They contradict each other often anyway. But you can't decide if this is Greco-Hellenistic literature or if this is Palestinian or Judeo. I hate the word Palestinian, but I can't use any other one. That's the area that the name that the Romans gave it on purpose. But if this is Judeo history of some kind, and if it's Judeo history of some kind, then it doesn't look like what we have in the Gospels. But if you look at Paul's letters, there's where you find history. You can find the authentic letters of Paul, you can find history. So once you start pulling the material out of the authentic letters, not all of them are authentic, but the main ones are, you can really reconstruct something of what happened there. And then you see the character that Paul knows something about is James, the brother of Jesus. And it's quite clear he even calls him the righteous one, the Tzaddik. So once you start picking up on these things, and then the Acts is the same as the Gospels until you get to the latter part, the we document. And when you get into the we document from around chapter 16 onwards, then you're getting quite a lot of history, if not completely historical. And the climax comes in Acts 21:21, when Paul meets James and comes up to Jerusalem, and you see James is the leader of the early church, and Paul has to do what James says, and James sends him into the temple to do something that he's totally opposed to, that is pay the expenses with the money he has of 4 people under Nazarite oath. And he's against any of these things you see from his letters. Anyhow, he's against the law. He's against all of these things, but he has to do it in order to show his subservience to James. So when you start picking up on these things, you can reconstruct the history, and that's how you move over towards the Dead Sea Scrolls and away from the Gospels.
And when you're looking for the history of Jesus, I've always taken the idea that the only piece of the puzzle that really is testable is the idea of royalty, the idea that Jesus was part of the royal family. And if so, then James is part of the royal family. And while we were talking about Acts, James' role in Acts, when you come to that section that Dr. Eisenman just cited for us, you find James sitting on a throne. It says thronos, and it says James says, I judge. He used the word krino. And then after James does his judgment, everybody else in opposition to James backs off. So it does look like James has a commanding role. Now, does that imply a royal role or a priestly role or both together? That's one can argue, but one can argue in favor of both, actually.
Well, I don't know where you get the idea of a royal family from except the Gospels. There's nothing in the scrolls about the righteous teacher being part of the royal family. They don't talk about the royal family at all. In fact, they're very much opposed to who's ever impersonating the royal family like the Herodians at this time. And so to talk about the royal family, what royal family? There is no royal family from around 500 BC on to 100 AD. I mean, this is just imagination to some extent. But what the scrolls are centered about is righteousness. Righteousness, that's what makes you a son of God. They're interested in sonship, not royalty. They're interested in symbolic sonship. and it is this righteousness ideology, the so-called sons of Zadok, the sons of the priesthood, the Zadokite ideology, and then that's where you find the James character fitting in. And the reason I put the Jesus character in is because at the end I say, who and whatever James was, so was Jesus. You can't reconstruct Jesus until you've reconstructed James. And if you try to do it from the sources that you have, then you're just getting into a Greco-Roman mystery cult.
I would say the Dead Sea Scrolls imply the royal heir to the throne when it talks about the branch of David and their expectations of the branch. And they link the idea of the branch to the unique teacher. So
they have that idea of a branch of David. Do they identify him with anyone? I don't know.
Well, gentlemen,
I don't think they identify anybody clearly. I think they just give descriptions of the various characters, and we have to do our detective work.
Anyway, you know more about the descriptions they have than I can remember, because I haven't looked at this material in 15 years, so I really can't pull it out of my brain anymore.
You know, we got to dust the cobwebs off, right? Well,
I'm 82, so I've lost a lot of information.
Well, you've done a lot of great work.
You remember more than I've ever learned, I'm sure. So.
Oh yeah, he probably forgot
more than I learned.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you guys this question, because they always go to carbon dating. Okay, this is they're always throwing that up in the face, right? Maybe we could deal with that, but in light of that, my question is this: context-wise or contextually, is there any contemporary to the 2nd or 1st century BC that you think this could even fit the narrative of the situation then? I mean...
No. But as far as the carbon dating goes, you can't get that kind of precision that they're claiming that they get. I have a whole attack on the carbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't bother reading it. I've been attacking the carbon dating since the 1980s. What good does it do? They go back to it because that's their only crutch that they have. They have this pseudo dating that they rely on, when in fact internal dating, internal historical dating that you can get, where you're clearly not attacking the Maccabean family, you're attacking the Roman Herodian establishment. And once you understand that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, then you move forward. So, I mean, these folks are never going to change, and we're never going to come to any agreement on it. But the point of the matter is that the establishment that's being attacked in the scrolls has nothing to do with the Maccabees. Therefore, it's not 2nd century. It's not even 1st century. It's around late 1st century BC into the 1st century CE.
Would you like to add something to that, Christopher?
Yes. So when it comes to the carbon dating is not a specific date. A lot of people have the misconception that the scientists pour in the data and their computer comes out an exact date. It's more of a range. And so they have a first sigma distribution range and a second sigma distribution range. And the first sigma distribution range, the date is 60, is a 2/3 probability that the actual date will be in there. But the second sigma distribution, it's a 95% chance the date will be in there because it's a larger range. And so when you look at the range of the Dead Sea Scrolls community, the range in the first sigma distribution is already a broad swath that goes from the 1st century BC all the way up to the 1st century AD. The both ends of it.
Yeah.
And so
that's their margin of error. They have a huge margin of error.
Exactly.
So I mean, rather than talk about carbon dating, and I don't want to keep talking about carbon dating because it's such a pseudoscience anyway for this period, because you don't have enough dated manuscripts, you don't have anything like that, and you're trying to talk out of whole cloth and to use this against internal information, which is so clear and so raw and sophisticated. That's the problem in this field. We're dealing with people who are unsophisticated in historical literary analysis, and so they fall back on a pseudo-analysis of a subject that is totally unreliable.
Well, Professor Eisenman, I'm glad that you segue into something different, because that is obviously someone can do some digging and figure out that there isn't that many 2nd century BC, 1st century BC writings. So something to compare as a, like you said previously, Christopher, a control by which you would test.
Well, they're dating the horse by the horse. They're using the Dead Sea Scrolls as their actual material from that period.
Well, looking at evidence within the scrolls for the 1st century dating, for 1st century CE dating, there's a lot of evidence in there. First of all, the evidence of the Zealots and their activities. It matches Yigel Yadin and Andre Dupont Summer both say, Yigel Yadin and Andre Dupont Summer, they say that the war scroll matches the 1st century army manuals of the Romans. And then Cecil Roth and G.R. Driver linked the scrolls to the 1st century Zealot movement. Barbara Thiering said there's a 1st century pattern of commentary style that matches in the Bible and in the scrolls. There's all sorts of reasons for a 1st century provenance. Dr. Eisenman, you mentioned the delay of the Perusia in some of the scrolls, and that's an indication for the later date of the scrolls of 1st century. I also bring in the evidence for the parables in the scroll. There's all kinds of parables, and as a consequence, that's an indication of the 1st century.
So, gentlemen, let me ask both of you this question, and I want both of your opinions, if you don't mind. Why were the Gospels written? I mean, what do you think the motivation for writing those Gospels, or at least the four?
It's obvious. It's obvious to subvert the Messianic movement in Palestine. Absolutely. I say that the scrolls represent the Messianic movement in Palestine. That's what the scrolls are. That's not what my colleagues said the scrolls are. They don't know what the scrolls are. They think the scrolls are Essenes. You look at Essenes, they're not supposed to be peaceful Essenes, contemplating their navels, not aggressive and so on. And yet Hippolytus in the 2nd century tells us there are 4 groups of Essenes, among whom he includes Zealot Essenes and Sicarii Essenes. And we know that the Sicarii were the people that occupied Masada, that were called Sicarii because they supposedly cut people's throats in assassination attempts and ultimately committed suicide on Masada. And we found scrolls on Masada. So we know that these two movements are linked in some way, and it's obviously that they are. So what I say is, yes, this is a Messianic movement in Palestine. This is not the Essenes that people like to imagine. Yes, these are Essenes, perhaps, but they're aggressive Essenes. That is, Sicarii Essenes, Zealot Essenes. And once you can grasp that the peaceful Essene model is only a model in the mind of our pseudo scholars all over the universe, and the ones who play games with carbon dating and know nothing about history and the interpretation of texts and text interpretation, then you start moving away from this, and you'll go back to the literature and text itself. And they've never emphasized not to mention appreciated, that these texts are totally Messianic. So you have a Messianic movement in Palestine, totally the opposite of the Greco-Hellenistic, Romanized, Paulinized movement that you get in the Gospels. And the Jesus in the Gospels is created in the image of Pauline literature and Pauline argumentation.
Now, in the Gospels, there are some real parts of Jesus that are preserved, but it's not the parts that the Bible thumpers like. It's the ugly parts of the Jesus story that they wouldn't have made up in making the picture look prettier later, such as Jesus saying, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one, or I come not to bring peace but a sword. These parts match the Zealot movement. The idea that Jesus called the Syrophoenician woman and her child dogs. This matches the xenophobia of the Zealot movement. And that also, by the way, is another tie back to the Maccabees. The xenophobia and the political nature, they combine their politics and their religion.
Yeah, no native Palestinian is going to be marrying a Phoenician woman.
Exactly. So for Jesus to say they're dogs shows a very realistic clip about Jesus, that the story got preserved because the Phoenician woman apparently knew her place, accepted her role as a dog, and said, yeah, but even the dogs get crumbs. And so this showed that she had faith, and the story got preserved. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had that part of the story preserved either.
Then if you call, of course, you have Paul's so-called mission to the Gentiles, that he's totally either reconstructed or created or imagined himself. So yes, fine, you can have a mission to so-called Gentiles in the Asia Minor Peninsula, in the Greco-Roman universe of Southern Europe. But the point of the matter is, first, these people have to convert to Judaism before they can be heir to the prophecies that were promised to the Jews. And of course, this is annoying to the Roman authorities, who see the Jews as a minor, troublesome people, always involved in revolution, always involved in protest. And of course, they're not going to be sympathetic to any material that is messianically inspired, that has to do with being Jewish. No, of course not. So Paul refurbishes the whole thing, and he, as I show at the end of my books and a lot of my books, Paul is from the Herodian family. Paul says at the end of Romans, and I take that literally, give my regards to my kinsman, the littlest Herod, the youngest Herod. Herodian means the young. He reveals right there that he isn't even Jewish. In fact, he comes from the Herodian family came from that area that we now call the Gaza Strip, and they took over Jewish Palestine by slaughtering all the Maccabees, the Jewish heroes that the Jews supposedly loved in the Maccabee books and so on. So we have a totally anti-Jewish ethos of this Paulinized material, and that's what survived, and that's why you have the Holocaust. That's why you have anti-Semitism, and that's why it still endures to this day, and it will go on, because unfortunately, as beautiful as the Gospels are, and I say they are beautiful, but they're anti-Semitic. And as long as you're walking around with an anti-Semitic guidebook in your pocket, you're going to have a tough time fighting off anti-Semitism.
Church fathers right off the bat totally agree. I mean, if you just research how anti-Semitic these pagan church fathers really were, it's quite interesting. So I didn't mean to cut you. Yeah, Christopher, I'm sorry I cut you off.
No, that's all right. We can all take turns. Just to get back to some of the links to the Zealot movement and to the militarism of this movement, that the Essenes were not all the peace lovers. The Sicarii, the alternative name, came from the name of their blade. It was called a Sika in Aramaic and Sicae in Latin. And linking the Zealot movement at Masada to this group, we have scrolls at Masada of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, and also the Book of Jubilees. And these are both identical to the scrolls from the Qumran caves. By the way, the people at Masada, they believed in the resurrection and had hope in it, because they had a scroll buried under their synagogue at Masada, and the scroll was a scroll of Ezekiel 37, which talks about the dry bones gaining flesh, etc. So they were
because they were looking forward to the resurrection,
right?
Because they knew they were going to commit suicide,
right?
So on that note, I think this is a good time to segue into something I'd like to ask Professor Eisenman his opinion on. I know your opinion, Christopher. You were on the show recently and kind of expressed the idea of the 40 years. Paul has this 3 days and 3 nights resurrection idea of Jesus. Okay, he's spouting that this Jesus character did die and rose again. And I was thinking of the context where it talks about the heresy of Philetus and Hymenaeus, how they had perceived that the resurrection had already happened. My question, Professor Eisenman, to you, in light of the James movement, which is tied in with this Jesus character that has obviously been politicized, Hellenized, whitewashed, completely Romanized, and washed over from being what we're looking at here, the Qumran sect. Do you believe that the original movement, that this man was put to death possibly by Pontius Pilate in the 30s, and that they really did believe he rose again then, or maybe they thought he was going to rise again in the future, and Paul was teaching that a resurrection already happened? Where do you put the idea that they thought he really rose again from the dead at? Is that a later concoction, and is that inserted into Paul, you think? Or do you think Paul really taught there was a Jesus who rose again from the dead in the 50s?
Well, you've thrown in so many aspects or questions here in one phraseology that it's very difficult for me to
Yes, sir. I'm
answer.
sorry.
But I would say this: it's all right. I would say, first of all, you have to realize this is all Hellenistic, Greco-Roman ideology in terms of a person, actually rising from the dead and returning to walk on earth, and all. You get that in the Greek literature. You get those things in Greco-Roman literature. You don't get this thing in any Palestinian Jewish literature. I hate to use the word Palestinian, but I can't help it. You don't get this picture at all. You don't get it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They may allude to, as Chris was saying, they may allude to a
Resurrection.
later world in the other universe, but they haven't got there yet. And the War Scroll talks about a final apocalyptic war against all evil on the earth being led by the angels who are going to join their camps. So this is a warlike movement. This is not a peaceful movement. This is not a turn the other cheek movement. Now, I know turn the other cheek is very appealing. I mean, that's so we love it, and I'm not against it. And if you love it, you love it. But that is not what was going on in Palestine. That was the way of subverting the Palestinian Messianic movement to make it pacifistic and pro-Roman. And until you can, as beautiful as it is, until you can appreciate what they're up to and know I don't say that the scrolls are beautiful. No, not necessarily. Because the scrolls are interested in one concept basically only, righteousness. And righteousness is not necessarily a beautiful thing. Righteousness is sometimes very harsh, very, being very stern, being very uncompromising, and being not the least bit peaceful in your attitude. And that's unfortunately what the scrolls are, so they don't attract. And the Gospels do attract. I'm not against them. All that makes me angry is to attach this to Jewish literature and to claim that this was going on in Palestine and to recreate a person that we have no proof even was like that. Therefore, if you don't look at James, you can't know what this character was. And we do get a picture of James, as I said, from Paul's letters, the end of Acts, and you glue this into the righteous teacher at Qumran, you can begin to develop a picture. But nowhere does it talk about, turning the other cheek, kissing someone who's died, or all that kind of thing. This is all Greco-Hellenistic literature, not history.
May I offer an alternative interpretation that still fits with what you're saying? That's still a militaristic idea. Is it possible that the turn the other cheek concept was part of the original Jesus movement's advice for agents who were caught and questioned by Rome?
How do you know there even was one? Why are you talking about something that you have no Palestinian proof of? You don't know anything about a Palestinian Jesus movement except from overseas sources. Where do you come up? You know a James, but you don't know anything about a Palestinian Jesus movement.
Well, I see James taking
over. You're just imagining this because you're still glued into the Gospels. The Gospels have taken over your mind, and they have totally influenced your whole outlook on the world and history.
I think you possibly misunderstood what I was trying to get at. Actually, I think that I'm just suggesting that it could have been a way of keeping their activity covert as they were planning their war against Rome, and they're being questioned by Romans. You turn the other cheek and don't give away that you're a zealot. Don't give away that you're a revolutionary. Keep it a secret. I'm just thinking of the kind of logic that's expressed in the Serach Hayat.
Well, Jesus itself is a Greco-Roman name. I mean, what name are you going to give this character in Palestine then? You want to talk about a movement in Palestine, then you got to talk about a Joshua movement or something.
Yeah, let's skip the movement concept. I just want to get to the idea of the turn the other cheek concept, and I'll get to the movement idea later. Yeah, the turn the other cheek idea, I think, is a way of don't give yourself away, be covert. The righteous man will have quote everlasting hatred.
I can't hear him anyway.
We're losing you, Chris.
Okay, I'm right up against my mic. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now, at that last moment.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I might have a bad.
No, I can't hear you again.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep the mic still. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Serach Hayahad, the rule of the community, says that a
How come
righteous
he goes
man,
in and out like that?
the rule of the community says everlasting hatred for the men of the pit in clandestine spirit. He should be a man
Yeah. No,
enthusiastic for the day of
no
revenge.
turning in love there.
No, exactly. So I think that the turn the other cheek, if it was at all part of the original movement, and it may not have been, but if it was probably more in the context of don't give your covert agency away.
Could it
Go
be?
the extra mile in the Roman roads, and don't let them know that you're one of the leaders of the Zealot movement, and that way you stay alive for another day.
That's plausible, but what do you think about this idea, Chris and Professor Eisenman? What I mean, to me, you have that as a possibility. To me, it's more likely though that this is like an instruction manual on trying to tell people do this, for the Romans. Like it's like a pro-Roman type of slant. I get what you're saying, but it just
The
when you
New Testament used it that way. The New Testament
right,
definitely used it to say, be nice to the Romans, because the New
right.
Testament is all pro-Roman.
Is
It's a
it to
rewrite.
hide who these people are? Possibly, but I kind of wonder with all the other stuff that adds up in it, is this really an authentic, what we're seeing movement here going on in the Gospels, or
Jesus
is
even
this a
associates with
whitewash?
Roman centurions. I mean, in the Gospels, this is for a Palestinian Messianic movement leader to have anything to do with a Roman centurion. This is in another universe.
Yeah, it is, and especially when you read about the whole idea of Cornelius being converted as a centurion, that whole nonsense. Especially since they Josephus mentions the Italian regiment in Caesarea and says that they were specifically anti-Semitic and they did such horrible
They are the most
atrocities.
violent of all.
Yeah, they were the worst of all, and Josephus refused to even describe the atrocities because
So it's
so
all
that's how bad
reversed.
they were. It's obviously a rewrite. So the New Testament is saying, okay, here's the centurions. They recognize Jesus first. Surely he's the Son of God. The Romans are enlightened. Pilate says, what crime has he done? The New Testament portrays the Romans as enlightened, yet the Jews, they see Jesus. He raises the dead. He feeds the 4,000. He feeds the 5,000. He walks on water. He does one miracle after another, heals whole villages, all these miracles all over the place, and the Jews just can't get it that this is the guy they've been looking for. It's obviously anti-Semitic hokum.
Well, it's obviously literature too. It's not, no one's walking on the waters except in people's imaginations and their desire to have something miraculous happen in their universe because they're all going to, die in the end, and they don't want to think about that. So they want to believe in miraculous things. Greco-Roman literature allows them to. Judaism never did.
So let me ask this question, and I know this is the big topic. I mean, everybody get Professor Eisenman's book, James, the Brother of Jesus. Okay, this book
Awesome
is
book.
super
1,000
important.
pages.
That unbelievable amount of information. I want to ask you one question. If I know you probably speculate there was a guy named Jesus, but is it possible that there wasn't a guy named Jesus, but really James was actually the movement's leader, and then the Romans made him have a brother to take the attention off of James? Do you think it's possible?
I don't see any reason why James couldn't have had a brother called Jesus. I mean, I've told you that I consider most of Paul's letters authentic. And in the letter to the Galatians, Paul actually does what the Gospels and the Roman literature usually doesn't even do, or Acts, that is. He says James is the brother of Jesus. And, he's sent up to see James, the brother of Jesus in Jerusalem, who's the leader of the movement. And we're thinking in the gospel terminology, oh, you mean James, the brother of John? Oh, you mean this is all diversionary material to throw you away from James, the brother of Jesus. They only towards the end begin to talk about there could be a brother of Jesus called James, and start forgetting about James and John, the sons of Zebedee, when they both get killed in the Gospels, so that therefore, when another James suddenly appears, who is he? Who is he? Who is he? So the point is that originally the Zebedee brothers, I used to like to call them Zippity Doodah, the Zebedee brothers are something to take your attention away from the real James and talk about these odd people that the Gospels have created, ahistorical people.
Now, I would like to get back to something that Derek asked earlier, and that's about the 40-year wait.
Yeah, please do.
The Dead Sea Scrolls keep on mentioning that it's going to be 40 years to the destruction of all the wicked men who turn back with the man of the lies. It's going to be 40 years until the righteous teacher pops up out of the grave. For example, in Damascus Doctrine, Fragment 2, it says, now.
We're losing you, Chris. We're losing you, brother.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, at that point, yeah.
Okay. Now, Damascus Document, Fragment 2, lines 13 to 15. Now, from the day when the unique teacher was taken until the overthrow of all the fighting men who turn back with the man of lies, there shall pass about 40 years. The commentary on Psalm 37, it says, on Fragment 1, line 6 to 8, at the end of the 40 years, they will be wiped out, and on the earth, not a wicked man will be found.
But those are not historical documents. Those are visionary documents. We don't know if
I
they're
agree
accurate, those things.
Well, I agree they're visionary documents, but I think they took the time
The
period.
Pesharim are different. The Pesharim, actually, that's why I usually just deal with the Pesharim. I don't deal with these other documents to that extent. The Pesharim, the Jewish word for commentary, Hebrew word for commentary, they actually deal with historical situations. And if you zero in on the commentaries, Pesharim, then you can start to reconstruct a real historical situation, not these general visionary documents that also extend.
Then let's go to one of the Pesharim. Let's go to the Psalm Pesher from Cave 4. The Psalm Pesher from Cave 4 in column 2, it says, they will die by the sword, by hunger, and by plague. And then it quotes Psalm 37, a short while yet, and the wicked man will no longer exist. I will stare at his place, and he will longer be here. Its interpretation concerns all the evil at the end of the 40 years, for they should be devoured, and upon the earth no wicked person will be found. Again, it's the same idea. It's coming up in the Pesharim, as I cited.
Well, I can't follow what he's saying, so it doesn't do me any good.
So technically, what he's saying is that it's the same idea that there's this 40 years and then the end of all wickedness was supposed to happen. And I suspect we're tying this into the first century.
This is visionary. This is not an historical analysis. That's a visionary analysis.
I think
let me finish. When you have the righteous teacher confronting the spouter of lying, and it tells what is happening between them, that's an actual historical situation. That's not a visionary situation. That's something that's actually happening then and there. And through those episodes, like in Paul's letters, when he encounters James and James sends him into the temple and so on, those are real historical situations. You can reconstruct something. From a visionary text, you can imagine, but that doesn't tell you real history.
Right. I agree with that 100%, Dr. Eisenman. The text I was quoting was from the Psalm Pesher from Cave 4, and I was quoting the part from the interpretation.
Well, they can have visionary material in the Pesharim. I'm only talking about the historical material when you have confrontations, arguments, interactions between people, not something that looks forward to an imaginary future that may or may not be real.
Exactly. I understand that.
As real necessarily because someone is having a vision. If I had a vision now and told you, in 50 years, Trump is coming back to rule the universe, are you going to believe me? Of course not. Of course
let's hope not.
I'm talking to the narrator. Are you going to believe me? Of course you're not.
You guys are funny.
If I tell you today Trump is arguing with the people who oppose him, you're gonna accept that.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Let's move. Let's shift topics here.
Let's shift.
Let's shift topics. Okay, so gentlemen, it looks like to me, and there's like a reverse of role. Okay, this is like you talked about the context of what's going on in here. The situation that we're finding in the New Testament and in the epistles, you've pointed out, Dr. Eisenman, that the language being utilized even by Paul, that he is aware of the literature of the Qumran sect, and he's flipping it on its head, almost like purposely reversing the roles and making the enemy the friend and the friend the enemy. In the light,
Yeah.
the people of light are darkness, and darkness is light. He flips it on its head. Do you guys want to
Well, I've
talk
written
about some
whole books
details?
about these things. I can't pull them out of my head now, but you're right there. And the point of the matter is that I think we should move over to Paul, the Roman Empire, Paul's Roman citizen. What's his ship? What's he doing walking around with a Roman citizenship? He gets that from his Herodian family roots, his Herodian origins, and so on. All the Herodians had Roman citizenship in perpetuity in honor of Herod, the destroyer of the Jewish people and the Maccabean family. Anyway, we go over to this Pauline Roman universe. And the Romans, of course, destroy the Jewish revolution in Palestine. They cause all of the Messianic zealot type of individuals to kill themselves on Masada and so on. The ones that haven't killed already. They wipe it all out. People want to know what happened to the Messianic movement. Some fled down into Egypt. A few got down there and maybe got down to the Arabian Peninsula. We talk about the wilderness camps. The War Scroll talks about the wilderness camps. There's more. The Qumran is one camp. It's not the only camp. So there are camps in northern Syria. Some of those probably survived and went into Islam. That's why Islam so resembles the Dead Sea Scrolls. Muhammad never saw a Dead Sea Scroll. But those people in the northern Syrian context where he was involved in his trade routes and in Egypt where he visited and so on and so forth, and the Cairo Geniza ends up with an actual, scroll document, those people did survive. So I would say 85% of the revolutionaries were liquidated in one form or another. The other Jews who did survive cooperated with the Romans and became somewhat of what Judaism is up to the present era before Israel was established. That's why the Jews couldn't fight during the Holocaust. They didn't know how to fight anymore. They didn't know how to oppose the secular authorities. They cooperated with the secular authorities to the extent of sacrificing themselves to them during the Nazi period. And very few ghettos were like the Warsaw Ghetto actually fought like that. Most of them went peacefully. People understand how come they went peacefully to the camps, because they'd already learned this 2,000 years before during the war against Rome. And this was going on for another 2,000 years in their history, the ones that did survive. This turned into Rabbinic Judaism. But Rabbinic Judaism is not the scrolls, which is why the rabbis generally are not terribly sympathetic to the scrolls in terms of ideology. But as you see, being a scroll-minded person, I am sympathetic to the ideology of the scrolls. I like their aggressiveness. I'm not interested in turning the other cheek. I like their call for righteousness, and I like the fact that they think all the righteous ones are the true sons of God. I believe if you're perfectly righteous, which is a hard thing to be, then you turn into a real son of God, and there isn't just one. There are multitudes, as many as there are righteous ones.
Interesting. Say,
Is it? Is it really?
no, I was going to say interesting, and I wanted to, Chris, can you hold that thought for 1 second? Because I wanted to ask Professor Eisenman one quick question, and you can just say yes or no if you don't mind, and that way
I never say yes or
okay.
no. Go ahead.
Okay, let me put it like this: could I become, if I wanted to, could I become a son of righteousness and be, according to the scrolls, could I become one if I followed and really committed? Is it something that I would be able to do?
I think, first of all, I don't know what conversion means or anything like that, but you have to convert to the Ten Commandments, to all of those things, basically what Judaism used to be. I'm not talking about the rabbinic Judaism that we're talking about now. I'm talking about the early primordial form of Judaism that the new Christians would have encountered in these teachers that went overseas to various places, not the Paulinized ones, the aggressive Qumran type ones. And once you were willing to do that, I think yes, absolutely.
Just because I'm not biologically from
no,
the
it's
tribes.
not a blood thing. It is not a blood thing. It's a behavioral thing.
Okay, thank you, sir. Christopher, what were you going to say, sir? Sorry to interrupt.
I kind of lost where I was going to go. but I still have something I want to talk about
Can't hear him again.
otherwise.
Yeah,
The
please do.
The overseer at Qumran, he was said to be a master of all the mysteries.
Don't keep talking about Qumran because I don't have the documents in front of me. I thought we were talking about general history here.
Oh, okay. Well,
He was going to talk about the overseer.
I just wanted to talk about.
He keeps going back to the scrolls. If he wants to just interpret these scrolls, that's just another person interpreting the scrolls. There are about 50, 60 people doing this, and none of them agree with each other on everything. So it doesn't do us any good to try to do better than them. It's better for us to look at the whole period and try to understand the whole period and what was going on, not what an individual scroll document says about that period.
Right. I'm not dealing with a particular scroll document. I'm thinking about Paul's snipe in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says, even if I have all knowledge and I know all mysteries and I can speak with the languages of men and angels, if I don't have love, I'm nothing. I'm wondering if you think that sounds like it is being specifically directed at the overseer of Qumran, who had to be a master of all mysteries and have all knowledge, and apparently was alleged to have spoke with the angels.
Did you catch that? Yeah. Eisenman? Okay, so no. Paul in 1 Corinthians seems to be what appears to Christopher addressing the leader or one of the leaders, correct, Christopher, of the Qumran
sect?
The overseer. Do you think that might be what's going on? He wanted your insight to see if you thought maybe Paul is kind of addressing these people and maybe even the leader.
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
You don't think he's addressing them?
No, I don't think he's doing anything. He's just stealing their documents, their ideology, their concepts, reversing them and moving on. I don't think he's not arguing with the people in the scrolls at all. He's just walking on with their material. But I think, in fact, he spent time at Qumran and he knows their ideology and doctrines in order to be able to use it and reverse it. And I think he was expelled from the Qumran community. He was one of the people that was expelled and thrown out. So he's not addressing any leader of the Qumran community. He's gone off into the new world with his Roman citizenship, his Roman connections, his Herodian connections. He's got tremendous advantages, and he's often running in what we now know is the Pauline Gentile mission.
I agree with that completely. I was just thinking he was insulting the overseer.
Oh, so he's thinking that Paul's actually insulting. He's trying to insult the Qumran community and their okay. Yeah, maybe. So what we're going to have to do, Chris, we're going to have to find a way to get you a mic because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding because they're not able to can't hear you as clear as he wants to.
No, we can't hear you.
I've been picking up on that. It's a definite flaw on the program.
It's okay. Hey, look, it's okay. That's what I'm here for. You know, I have the gift of being able to interpret tongues. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, you can rephrase what people say and say it to the other party so they get the right meaning.
So what is going on here? You mentioned the history, the overlap. You want us to look at the history, Professor Eisenman, and see what's going on overall. And I think that's where a lot of people miss the point, especially people who believe in the New Testament, for example. Well, they're drinking the Kool-Aid. But if you actually start looking at the overall image, this seems like a political machine, that what we're seeing in the New Testament.
People don't know there was a war in Palestine. If you tell them there was a huge war in Palestine where the revolutionary Jews were liquidated, you tell them this kind of thing, they're like, why? What did I say? So you tell them, read Josephus' War, read his, antiquities and so on. But they also don't know that there was a new Roman emperor coming into being, the Flavian dynasty, and they were the Roman generals in Palestine. And the weirdest thing was recently I saw something that was talking about the monuments in Rome, and they were talking about the Colosseum, and they were explaining that this was built immediately after the Jewish war by Vespasian and Titus, and it has a dedicatory plaque on it that no one ever looked at. This was built by Titus or Vespasian, I'm not sure which, with the money that they took from their defeat of the Jews in Palestine. Wow. In other words, this was taken from the Colosseum itself was built from Jewish booty money, and nobody even knows that. So you're starting in a world of total ignorance. And then
Wow.
you start there, and then you can get them start moving.
Do you think, and I mean, I like to speculate. I'm a big speculator guy. I mean, I just enjoy these things. Do you think it's
Well, I
possible?
hope you don't lose any money speculating.
Hey, I'm not betting anything. I'm just playing games.
I mean, the stock market I'm talking about.
Let me ask you this, because this is a fascinating point. You found that's written there, that's clearly built off the money that was taken from the war. Do you
That's what it
think
says. Actually, on the only inscription they found on the Colosseum stone was this little inscription that says it was taken from the money that the Flavians or Vespasian or Titus, which one, I don't know, got or took or had available to him from the war against the Jews in Palestine? Yes, that's what the Colosseum says. And who has ever heard that before?
this
Even I
this
was.
is
I had my. It just it just amazed me.
you actually brought that up last time, and now it makes me wonder if these situations.
No, I didn't know it last time.
Well, I'm talking about when you and me did a show. You mentioned this to me and Luther last time, and I just, it refreshed me. We didn't do a show too long ago, but I was going to ask you something that makes me think. We date the Gospels post destruction of the temple, and
I just learned this about 2 months ago, so I don't know when we did a show.
I think you dropped it the last time we were here, but either way,
Okay.
That's a fascinating piece of evidence that I wonder if the Gospels are trying to poke at, because Jesus comes on and says, tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days. Well, this is a Romanized version of the story. Could it be that this is kind of way of saying we're going to build our own temple?
This is all magical talking. This is Hellenized, hopeful literary activity being expressed. And, I mean, you will never find this in any Jewish literature, and you won't find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What, rebuild the temple in 3 days? A person is going to rebuild the temple in 3 days. I mean, this is never going to happen. It never was going to happen. In fact, I would say we don't want it to happen. Why? We don't want a priesthood back. If you build a temple, you've got to have sacrifice of animals. I don't want animal sacrifice. I don't want priests doing sacrifice. I would never rebuild the temple. I would leave it in ruins, period, and I would build a shrine on the Temple Mount. Not where the temple or the mosque is. I don't have to disturb the Islamic shrines. They want a shrine up there, let them have a shrine up there. But I would build a commemoration of the return of the Jews to Palestine, Israel, on the Temple Mount, a shrine to commemorate the return of the Jewish people to their land. I wouldn't dictate any what they should do, like kill animals and sacrifice animals for sin and all this kind of, very, very primitive, old-fashioned behavior.
Christopher, you have something you'd like to add, sir?
As far as shrines in Israel, no, I'll leave that to someone who's from Israel, and someone who's. I don't have a stake in it there, so I don't have a say.
Let them kiss the Rhodian stone if they want.
Yeah, no, he said he'd rather leave that to someone like you who's from there and is aware of the area and all this.
I feel it very passionately. I am a nationalist. I believe in that. I wouldn't even allow the people to kiss the stones where they kiss on the Wailing so-called wall, because those stones were put up by Herod on the backs of Jews that he slaughtered. Jews, revolutionary Jews, the Maccabean Jews, and so on. Those are Herodian stones and an Herodian temple that I consider illegitimate. Now, the Jews kissing those stones, they're expressing an emotion that they have. Fine. They don't know what Herod was. They don't know what these stones represent. Someone has to stand up in front of them and say, no, stop. Don't do this. Pull these stones down. Go up to the Temple of Mount. Don't build a temple. We don't want priests again. Build a shrine. You want you want something to kiss, to express your emotion of having returned to this country. Fine, go up. Why can't you go up on the Temple Mount? If the world doesn't want you there, I would what do you call it when you annex something? I would annex it. I wouldn't play this game that they're forced to play, that they can visit it in small numbers now if they behave very, very nicely. No. This was taken after a huge amount of suffering, after 6 million people were slaughtered and so on, by a few survivors who were able to return and fight their way to Jerusalem. My great grandfather walked to Jerusalem from Bielorussia in the 1880s and 1890s, and he settled in Jerusalem, and he's buried on the Mount of Olives. And he took 2 of his sons with him who had a family there. I don't know if they're still there. I'm not in touch with those people, but I do know where his grave is on the Mount of Olives. And after the 6-Day War, I refurbished it and I fixed it up because it had been thrown over by the Arabs, the Palestinians, whoever you want to call them. And I bought 10 tombs for my family on the Mount of Olives, so that they could be near him, not right next to him, because that's all taken. But there were empty spaces. I built spaces, and I put my father up there, and I put my mother up there, and in 2 of them that I bought, and I have 8 left, and my great grandfather is there, and that's what we did. He walked to Palestine all the way. He went to Constantinople, and from Bielorussia, 2 sons came to America. I'm descended from that part of his family. 2 others went with him. Younger ones went with him to Palestine. Their cousins and so on. I don't know very much at the moment, but that what he did there, and the fact that he worked all the time in a public service institution, a hospital, was honored by giving him and his wife a gravesite on the Mount of Olives.
Speaking of graves, I wanted to ask you about this. This is interesting discussion. I think you might appreciate this, Mr. Lawson. Do you think they found the grave of James, the brother of Jesus, and maybe Jesus? Do you think they found these guys?
You wanted to come to that ossuary. I know what you wanted to do.
Yes, sir. I was going to ask your opinion on it because
the literature says that he was buried where he fell after he was pushed from the temple wall. That's in Eusebius quoting an earlier source, and that you can see where he would have been pushed from the temple wall and later killed where he fell and buried there. And then the later literature says that there was an ossuary somewhere in the some of the churches there, the sort of more not the Roman so-called, but more the Greco Byzantine type of Christianity churches, and then that disappears. Now, I don't know if, according to the later materials and beliefs, the Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, which is the center of a pilgrimage, is the burial place of James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, they talk about James of Zebedee maybe, but it's the burial place of James. And the ossuary, there is an ossuary there under the altar there, and there's a pilgrimage, as you know, to Santiago de Compostela to this very day every year. And so, I mean, I would think that if there was an ossuary, if it had to do with James, it's sitting there in the church in Santiago de Compostela. It's not this ossuary that someone concocted recently in Palestine because it may have had the name Jacob on it.
What do you think about that, Chris?
Well, I'm not familiar with the James of Zebedee ossuary that Dr. Eisenman is speaking of, but I did want to comment before we get too far from what Dr. Eisenman was saying earlier. All that family history and all that passion was wonderful to hear. And the idea of such passion, I think, is very illustrative and is very helpful for your listeners to realize this is the kind of passion that the early followers of Jesus and associates of Jesus would have had. And they imagine when they see Romans in the Holy Land, when they have that kind of passion for this land. They're
Why do you keep mentioning Jesus? You don't have anything from him. You don't know what he had, what he said, what passion he had. You have something from James, but you don't have anything that you can ascribe to Jesus with any authenticity. Why do you talk about passion for Jesus when there's nothing that we can be sure of in terms of coming from him?
Well, I suppose I'm speculating
You're
because
back
I
to the
don't have any
Gospels,
evidence.
always over and over and over again, even though you don't want to be.
Well, sure. The I was just thinking that there is so much passion involved in nationalism. When I read the Maccabees and I read the kind of passion they have, I get the sense that the group of Jesus had around him had that same kind of theme going for him. I certainly read it that kind of passion in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and
I can't hear.
yeah,
You
I,
would
I
have to interpret it.
yeah, I wish the mic would be clear so that Dr. Eisenman could hear it. I would have loved to have quoted a passage from the scrolls that I think uh, is from their righteous teacher, but if he can't hear it, there's going to be no point for
Well,
asking him to
we
comment.
can if we can give it a shot. Let me let him know what you just said here, because ultimately he's saying the zeal that you have, the passion for nationalism, it clearly invokes an ancient idea that's rooted in this very thing we're talking about with the Qumran sect. That they were very nationalistic, they were very
Absolutely.
zealous about their land and their traditions and their God, and that these Romans who were in there invading their country, so to speak, and telling them, here, pay these taxes. They wanted
Crush them, yeah.
freedom. They wanted freedom from that, and they were freedom fighters technically. And
Right.
so you have
So
that
were the
same zeal,
Maccabees.
right? So he was
So were the
just saying that
Maccabees against
he,
the Alexanders, the successors of Alexander's oppression in Palestine. The Maccabees actually achieved freedom and a state for a certain amount of time till the Herodian Romans crushed them. And now they're reviving the Maccabean spirit in the scrolls. And that's why the Maccabees are not the enemies of the scrolls. It's the spirit of the Maccabees are back in the scrolls, and they're going to
wow,
fight once again for their independent state. And now we fought again, but we've gone through so much suffering on the way to this final struggle. Therefore, I say, don't give up anything. Don't take a step backwards. Don't give in. You have suffered so much. You have given so much for this. Fight it through to the end.
right, and that's exactly what we see. If you don't mind, Mr. Eisman, give it a shot, Chris. Hopefully he can hear you. There's a quote he wants to quote. Where's this from, Chris?
It's from the hymn scroll from Cave 1.
From the hymn
And
scroll from
He
Cave
keeps
One.
quoting things to me.
Yeah, he's trying to just
He's a
carry
quote
a
man. Yeah,
yeah,
he's a
he's
quote man.
enjoying the dialogue, and he's not trying to prove anything. He's just
No, I
wanting
know.
to
No, he
discuss
likes
these things.
quotes. He likes quotes.
Yes, sir.
yeah,
Let him.
I just wondered who you think who wrote the hymn scroll, Dr. Eisenman, in your opinion?
Who wrote the hymn scroll?
Yes,
I don't know who wrote any of the scrolls per se. I know the kind of people who wrote them. They
that's what I
were
mean.
these
What was
extremely, I just told you, I described who they were. They were this extremely zealous, righteous, passionate fighters for freedom, righteousness, and the restoration of freedom of the kingdom of the Jewish people, or not even kingdom, of the living space, the sovereignty of the Jewish people. And the rabbinic Jews were not too much interested in that. So the
mhm.
Jews that survived were the ones who were willing to do the compromising. But now we've returned to the other kind. And the scrolls come to light just when we've turned to the other kind. And therefore, I think that the scroll ideology is a good motivating. I don't think it's modern enough to be acceptable to most people, but it's a good motivating, as Chris is picking up on, a good motivating push towards this messianism, if you want to call it that.
I've heard the quote before, and it does sound very messianic.
Which one? Give me the quote again.
Yeah, quote. Go ahead and
Okay.
try and quote it, Chris.
All right, here we go. It says, they said of the vision of knowledge, it is not certain. Can you hear me so far?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And of the path of your heart, it is not that. But you, O God, will answer them, judging them with your power according to their idols and their numerous sins, so that in their schemes are caught those who deviate from your covenant. At the judgment, you will annihilate all the men of deception. There will be no longer exist seers of delusion, for they do not value me, even though you exhibit your power in me and reveal yourself in me with your strength to enlighten them. You have not covered in disgrace the face of all those looking for me. Those who unite together for your covenant, those who walk on the path of your heart, have listened to me. They have aligned themselves with you in the council of the holy ones. Through me, you have enlightened the face of the
Well,
many,
Chris
you have
likes
increased them.
quotations. He
Yep,
likes quotations from the scrolls and so on. He's a greater
yep,
believer in the Dead Sea Scrolls than I am in terms of its ideology, but okay, those are inspirational passages. They don't. They're nothing to do with history per se. They show the spirit of the materials, and that spirit, as I've been saying, runs all through the scrolls. But he's taking them literally word for word for word, and I'm not interested in something that's 2,000 or 2,500 years old, whatever it is, literally taking it literally. I'm interested in new literature. I'm interested in a new voice that speaks to the modern Jewish people in a manner that they can understand, can be inspired like that. But that isn't going to speak to the average person in a manner that they can understand. It's very inspirational, but it's
right.
not going to help anything.
I just wonder who that person is. He's certainly megalomaniacal, or he thinks he
I
has
have
a
no
very
idea who
major
it is.
role.
I
Huh?
don't know. I don't know who wrote these different scrolls.
Well, it sounds to me like the righteous
Maybe
teacher
I
or
did.
the overseer of the sect. And
What?
he says that the person who's writing that is saying that these people were looking for him, and these are covenant people, and they were listening to him, and that there were many of them, and that he's in opposition to seers of delusion and men of deception.
Well,
That
you're looking to unravel the puzzle of the scrolls. I'm
yes,
not looking to unravel the puzzle of the scrolls in its actual itemization. I
okay,
take the general spirit of the scrolls and inspiration of the scrolls and move forward. I
all
don't
right.
want to know
I'm trying to unwrap the puzzle.
whether Jacob ben Yaakov or Joshua ben Zedekiah or someone like that wrote this particular piece. I want to know what is the moving spirit that can move us today and help us move forward to restore ourselves and restore our land.
Well, hey, brothers, I really appreciate you guys joining me. We are at our 1 hour and 10 minute mark approximately, and I just wanted to conclude here. Everybody who's watching this, you guys can see that there's a first century relevance to these texts. That is the point they're trying to make. Get the book if you're wanting to really see some proof. Definitely check out Robert Eisenman, Professor Eisenman's book, James the Brother of Jesus, where he not only makes a case for James' existence, he says, well, whoever James is, it's a good chance you're going to find out who Jesus was. So you definitely got to get the book, and he has a lot of other stuff about the Dead Sea Scrolls you want to check out. He's forgotten more than he knew, and more than I'll ever learn, so I really appreciate that. And Christopher Lawson also has his book. You guys can get in PDF format. Just shoot me an email. It'll be down in the description. If you guys want to give a donation, you're more than happy to, and I could send you, he has 3 or 4 PDFs. One of the main ones is Reconstructing Jesus. What if the historical Jesus was the heir to the throne? A reconstruction based on the first century Dead Sea Scrolls. I appreciate you guys joining me on the show. Do you have any closing statements you'd like to make, Professor Eisenman and Chris?
Well, I don't know what the heir to the throne could possibly be anyway, so I can't comment on that, and particularly for the present day. As far as my latest book, I wrote about the freeing of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I just finished that last year, and that's out for people. They can read the whole story of how we freed the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were under the control of this establishment group of scholars, and including all Christian ones and very few Jewish ones, and certainly no Jewish nationalist ones. And one couldn't see all of the scrolls. They just released a certain number. There was a professor in Oxford, Vermesh, his name was, who thought he was Jewish, but he wasn't even Jewish. And his ideas are like amazingly, way out of context. And all these people were considered experts. So when you free the Dead Sea Scrolls, you not only free all the fragments so everybody can look at. And we did then publish all the fragments in a complete 2-volume version because I got a hold of all of the fragments because I knew the person who was photographing them up at the Huntington Library. And I got a hold of all of the fragments, and James Robinson, who's now passed away, and I published them. So we published all the fragments. And in doing so, we want to also free them from the control of this mindset that I've been referring to throughout this discussion that still exists, as you see. It exists in this scholarly framework, and to some extent, Chris is free of it. But on the other hand, he's part of this mindset in the sense that he takes some of its parameters for granted, and I don't take any of that for granted. I move forward from where we are now, and the inspiration of righteousness, passion, nationalism, and a Jewish territory for Jews to be what they are is my main goal.
And I'll close with saying thank you, Dr. Eisenman, for all you've done in the work for scroll research and in the interpretation of it. I think there is no scholar of scroll studies that could do their work and call it complete if they haven't taken your work into account. And I say thank you for getting the scrolls to be free, all your work with Huntington Library, and all the abuse you took from Herschel, Shanks, and Associates from Biblical Archaeology Review, and you took it in stride. I say you're the man of the hour, you're the man of our century, and if they had some sort of medal for it and I was in charge of assigning it, you would be getting one. So thank you, Doctor.
Well, give it to my great-grandfather, too. Thanks a lot. He inspired me.
MythVision Podcast, Derek Lambert, thank you for joining me. We'll see you next time.